My name is Sandra. I am 38 years old, and today I own nothing. I sit on a cold park bench. The wood is hard and damp. My children, Leo and Mia, sleep beside me. Their small bodies shake in the cold night. Their breathing is shallow. I spread my coat over them, trying to cover them, but it is not enough. The wind cuts through my skin. 1 month ago, I had a warm home, a bed, a kitchen, a husband, and a future. I never thought my life would end like this. I look at my dirty hands. The skin is cracked, and my fingernails are black with dirt. I stare at the empty street. No cars, no people, only weak light from street lamps. I quietly ask myself how I ended up here. I am tired and broken, but I cannot sleep. Who will protect my children if I sleep? I grew up alone. My parents died when I was young. I had no siblings or grandparents. At school, I was always the girl who sat alone. I dreamed of a real family, a place to belong. Then I met Mark. He was charming and good-looking. He promised to take care of me. We got married. When Leo and Mia were born, I thought my life was perfect. But people change. Mark became distant, came home late, and smelled of strange perfume. He no longer looked at me and yelled that I was boring. Then, the worst day came. It snowed in New York, and Mark brought a beautiful woman home. He told me to pack my things and leave. I stood on the sidewalk with Leo and Mia. We were alone in the cold city, without family or friends. We walked to the bus stop, and I counted my money. I had some savings, but not much. Leo was hungry, and Mia was freezing. I wanted to calm them, but I was desperate. I found a cheap room and gave the landlord my last money. But when we arrived, the key did not fit. I knocked, but a strange man said I had been scammed. My money was gone. That night, we slept in a fast food restaurant. The next day, I had no money, no home, and no food. I got a job as a night cleaner, but the pay was low. Every night I left Leo and Mia in a motel room while I worked. I was always hungry. I bought bread for the kids and lied that I had eaten too. I had to save every cent to pay for the motel. Mr. Henderson, the owner, was cruel. One night, I saw an old woman on a bench. She shivered and wore thin clothes. I knew that cold. I gave her my red wool scarf, the only thing left from my mother. She smiled at me, grateful. I went back to work and froze, but my heart felt warmer. I did not know that this moment would change everything. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. My hands were numb. I could hardly feel it as I brushed hair from the children's faces. They both had dark rings under their eyes. I whispered words of hope that felt empty. Then I led them to a nearby soup kitchen. Its sign seemed to promise mercy even from far away. We waited a long time in line. The people behind us wrapped themselves in coats of misery. Mia cried softly until I lifted her up. Leo was too proud to whine, but his stomach growled loud and without pause. I squeezed his small hand tight. Inside, it smelled of burnt onions and wet coats. We received 3 bowls of soup and warm white bread. I watched the kids spoon the soup, hungry. I forced a smile, though I tasted nothing. After eating, we sat on the floor in the corner. I tried to make a plan. The night cleaner job was not enough. I needed a solution. I went to the welfare office. I dragged the kids into a bare waiting room. Everyone stared ahead, silent, as if they could turn invisible by will. The woman behind the counter was kind, her smile practiced. She kept asking me for a moment of patience. She flipped papers, typed, and walked to the copier. I told her about Mark, the apartment, the stolen money. The children. She nodded, made notes, typed again. At last, she said the housing list was long. I could try an emergency shelter. She wrote an address on a slip and handed it to me. I wanted to ask if there was hope, but I did not dare. The silence of the waiting room hung heavy as we left. We walked to the shelter. The walk was long, and Leo said his legs hurt. I invented a treasure hunt. I told him a surprise waited at the end. He knew it was a lie, but he played along. Mia finally fell asleep in my arms. We arrived in late afternoon at a low concrete building with sealed windows and 2 watching officers. Inside it smelled of disinfectant. The dorms were packed with cots. A young woman named Janice led us to our corner and showed the showers and toilets. I noticed there were no locks on doors, no safety from other night residents. I built a fort from thin blankets for Leo and Mia and stayed awake to guard them. On the first morning, I got a call. I did not know the number, but I answered because hope makes limits easier to bear. A raspy voice spoke on the other end. It was the woman from the park bench, whose name I never learned. She wanted to thank me and said she was in the hospital. Someone had seen me wrap the scarf around her and then helped her. She could not offer much now, but she knew someone who needed a house helper. It was the first ray of light in weeks. I wrote the address on a flyer back and went there. The house was clean, the yard neat. An older lady opened the door, her hair snow white, her fingers shaky. Her name was Mrs. Berkowitz, and she needed someone to shop, clean the bathroom, and bring her pills. I agreed at once. The work was easy, and after each shift, she gave me a peanut butter sandwich for the kids. Sometimes I stayed and told her about Leo, Mia, our lost home, and my ex now in Manhattan. She listened like the grandmother I never had. One evening, I brought the kids to Mrs. Berkowitz, and she insisted on inviting us to dinner. There was soup, nothing like the soup kitchens, and still warm bread. Mia laughed when Mrs. Berkowitz folded a napkin like a crown for her. Leo talked about his treasure hunt, and for the first time in ages, I watched my kids happy. Mrs. Berkowitz finally offered us her guest room. She said 3 in a room was better than a park bench. I hesitated, but fatigue beat my pride. I said yes. During the first nights, Leo and Mia slept in my arms, as if we could shield each other. Slowly, I grew used to the new home and the warm light that filled the hall at night. I began to dream again. Not of a perfect life, but of the chance I could make it, step by step, soup by soup. When I look at my hands today, I still see the cracks, but they remind me that I never stopped fighting, and that my kids never, not one day, stopped believing in me. In summer, we moved together to a small farm near the city edge. Mrs. Berkowitz had owned the house forever, she said, but it had become too big. We rented the upper floor, and she insisted we were friends, not tenants. She showed Leo how to tend the vegetable garden, and Mia could cook jam with her. I worked mornings in a grocery store and afternoons for Mrs. Berkowitz. At night, I still cleaned, but the money barely covered rent, and the kids finally had beds. 1. On the first day in our new house, the sun hung low above the fields. 2. I tiptoed barefoot through the cool kitchen. 3. I climbed on a stool to reach coffee beans in the cupboard. 4. I saw a small photo, young Mrs. Berkowitz in an old blouse, hands on hips, proud yet sad. 5. Beneath it sat a photo of an older man with wild glasses and untidy hair. 6. I asked her later who he was. 7. My husband, she said, and me. 8. She laughed dryly, and in that sound, I heard my own life, loss mixed with hope. 9. On Sundays, we often sat on the porch and watched the kids circle the apple tree. 10. Mrs. Berkowitz told stories of her life in Berlin, of war, exile, and her move to New York. 11. I was too young for nostalgia, yet I suddenly felt how stories run like threads through time. 12. They spoke of the same fears, the same hunger. 13. Sometimes I felt she chose me to keep her past alive or share it with Leo and Mia. 14. In late summer, I got a letter from Mark. 15. It was printed, not handwritten. The greeting was formal, almost businesslike. 16. He wanted to see Leo for his birthday. 17. He sent a check and asked for a meeting in a restaurant in Manhattan. 18. I held the letter and asked if I was strong enough for my new role: mother, survivor, giver. 19. That night, I lay awake and wondered if I hated Mark. 20. I learned I did not. 21. I had no energy left for hate. 22. I had no energy for anything that was not linked to my children's survival. 23. So on Leo's birthday, we rode into the city. 24. I chose the cleanest clothes we owned and braided Mia 2 neat pigtails. 25. On the train, people looked at us like an unfinished family, but I was immune to their gaze. 26. The restaurant was in a glass tower, napkins folded like art, waiters in tails. 27. Mark arrived late, together with a perfume woman. 28. Her name was Shannon. She wore a dress and eyed Leo and Mia, unsure how to greet kids. 29. Leo was shy, and Mia stared at Shannon as if she were a rare zoo animal. 30. Mark talked about his new job, his travels, his plans. 31. I saw his hands twitch on his glass, and he never asked how we lived since he left. 32. It felt like he hoped I would vanish, yet I sat here with the kids and cracked hands. 33. At the end of the meal, he handed Leo an expensive plastic helicopter. 34. Mia received a glitter bracelet. 35. Then he stood as if to leave and asked if I might need more money someday. 36. We manage, I said, as always. 37. Shannon muttered, so polite, and I was unsure whether she meant me or herself. 38. On the way home, kids slept together. I saw a neon blur and thought of Mrs. Berkowitz in nights. 39. I thought of all the women I saw in the waiting room, their empty looks, their silent stories. 40. Maybe I was now one of them. 41. That night, after tucking the kids in, I smelled jam and bread and heard an early bird outside. I forced my tired legs down to the kitchen again. Mrs. Berkowitz sat at the table, stirring her tea and reading the horoscope in the New Yorker. She pointed at the pot as if saying, "Sit down." I sat. We sat silent, and behind the quiet waited questions I feared. Her husband, Berlin, everything she had lost. After a time, she said, "In the end, from each place you keep only the best." She smiled. Her eyes grew moist, but her back stayed straight. I did not get every word, but I knew what she meant. I was still tired, still hungry, still full of fear. But I was no longer alone. That night, I saw my healing hands and knew the cold and the light had names. In the morning, I'll wake the kids, cook breakfast, and promise their imperfect mom will never quit. I still stood on the cold floor when Mrs. Berkowitz looked at my feet and giggled. I understood when I looked down. My big toe poked through the cotton sock, a tiny hole. I laughed, and we both laughed like two girls. Then she said, "You need new socks. Good women show worn soles." I was unsure if she was serious, yet I did not care. It felt like a compliment. Next morning, Leo, Mia, and I trudged through wet grass to the mailbox and found a bulging envelope. No return name, no stamp. Dropped by some ghostly hand. Inside was a bundle of coupons, grocery store, drugstore, even a hair salon. A note said only, "For the next stretch." E. I cursed softly. If it was a prank, it was clever. Yet it smelled like Mrs. Berkowitz's handwriting. I took the coupons and walked with the kids into town. At nap time, I told Mia the envelope came from a good fairy. She giggled and asked whether the fairy was red or blue. "One with gray hair and warm hands," I said, and we agreed no fairy could beat Mrs. Berkowitz. In fall, I started an online class at night. When the kids slept and the house was quiet, I sat at the old table and logged in. Basics of accounting. I understood almost nothing, but I copied notes, practiced, and asked questions even when I felt foolish. After 3 weeks, the teacher emailed me. "You are disciplined. Keep going. People like you find their way," it read. For the first time, I learned how pride tastes, not sweet, salty with a hint of bitterness. One evening near the end of November, the doorbell rang as I lifted Mia from the tub. She smelled of soap and had wet hair like seaweed on her forehead. Outside stood a man with a neat beard, gray coat, and briefcase. I knew his face from the soup kitchen window, from long ago. He introduced himself as a social worker. He paused and said, "People speak well of you, Mrs." Unsure which name to use. I supplied the name, and he smiled, shy. He gave me papers, pointed to a line, and said I could apply for training support. He told me to at least try. I put Mia to bed, then sat with tea and the forms at the kitchen table. I read and read, understood half, yet wrote in everything that came to mind. I recalled dragging through New York offices, nods and smiles that were only masks. This time, it felt different. Maybe because this time I knew what I wanted, or because, for the first time ever, I was truly ready to accept help. The first snowflakes came early this year. One sleepy morning, the kids shuffled down the hall. We looked outside. The world was white, as if chaos was covered. In the living room, Mrs. Berkowitz opened her arms, wanting to hug the snow. She said snow is a second chance for the land, and Leo asked if people get one too. I tried to answer, but Mrs. Berkowitz spoke first. "Every day, my boy, every day is new." Winter was hard, but we got through. I worked, studied, and sent applications, while Mia drew on the kitchen wall. "This is our home," she said proudly, and I could not scold her. Leo carried home a certificate. Best friend in class. I cried when I read it, and Leo rolled his eyes. "Mom, that is only paper," he said. Yet it felt like winning something I had never searched for. In spring, I rang a downtown doorbell. No park bench, no motel anymore. I had an office interview, front desk, appointments, phone duty. I wore a borrowed blazer pinned at the shoulders, the fabric scratched, but I stood tall. The woman inside was young and stylish, smelling of mint and questions. She studied me, asked about resume gaps, the kids, and my English. I did not lie or dodge. At last she said I was different from the others. I was unsure whether that was good or bad. 3 days later, she called. The job was mine. I ran through the garden to the apple tree and shouted the news to the kids. They did not know what job meant, but they jumped with joy, and that was enough. That night, we sat in the kitchen again. I made cocoa and told Mrs. Berkowitz about the interview. She smiled with closed lips and said, "I knew it." Then she pulled a bottle of sparkling wine from the cabinet. "It was saved for good times," she said. Later, alone, I heard the wind carry apple blossoms through the open window. I knew I had truly made it, though much still waited. The night was no longer as cold as before. In the next weeks, we celebrated small victories. Mia learned to ride her tricycle without falling. Leo brought a classmate home to play. I finished a tax form without getting sick. Later, Mark sent a message asking about the kids, and I answered politely but brief. I no longer thought of him, the perfume woman, or the years he stole. I thought of Leo, Mia, and Mrs. Berkowitz. I thought of the kitchen table under apple branches and the floral socks she gave me. Sometimes, looking in the mirror, I counted the cracks in my hands. They never fully vanished, yet they no longer spoke of loss. Now they remind me of what I hold on to. For me, for the children, for everyone who deserves a second chance.